Cette petite chatte est allée à 157 km au-dessus de la surface terrestre. Ce n'est plus Félix, nous l'avons baptisé Félicette, mais naturellement en souvenir du chat aux aventures extraordinaires. Elle est la première chatte astronaute du monde.
We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through every mistake, failure, and explosion that made modern space exploration possible. We are, as always, your hosts, Quinn,
Chris,
and a faint sighting of Chris.
I'm gonna warn you that Koo has joined us for our episode today.
Oh my god, that's perfect, because my cat, Paisley, just left, so she might be coming in. Yeah, and that's pretty fortuitous because, you know, I'm hoping that this episode can cheer everybody up a little bit. I think it's going to be a fun one. And first things first, a couple of listeners have let me know that they've noticed us talking a lot about the Soviets recently, almost exclusively about the Soviets on a lot of episodes. We've had an episode on Gagarin, we had 3 on Sputnik 1 on the Soviet dog program, space guns. So do not worry, listeners. We noticed that too, and it's definitely not our goal or ambition for this to be a podcast that pulls punches or to put undue focus on any one nation or program. The Soviets are just such a ripe target, you know? They're the low-hanging fruit.
They're a treasure trove of accidents and mishaps.
And we've taken our baby steps. With the Cosmos 954 episodes, we talked about it where the Soviets were half to blame, you know, because the Soviets made the horrible satellite and they're to blame for it crashing. But Canada and the US were responsible for the massive failure of a cleanup. And then, you know, like any addict, I immediately went back and I did the Space Guns episode.
I would dare say that is not necessarily a failure, because by all means, they came up with something slightly better than an anemic 9mm to bring up into space.
Yeah, and it was a failure that they even tried. They had to succeed to get over a failure, and because Alexei Leonov couldn't stay in his seat. Anyway, you're drawing me back in. You're feeding the addiction, Chris. God, you're enabling me. So, long story short, listeners, my co-hosts here are going to help me, and you're going to also help keep me honest and keep me true with this. We are starting Soviet September. It's like sober September, except I'm not allowed to talk about the Soviet Union for the next, let's say, 4 episodes.
Hi, my name is Quinn, and I welcome to Astronauts Anonymous.
And in order to get rid of one addiction, I figure why not go back to where this whole podcast started and scratch another itch: the mistreatment of test animals.
You told me that we were going to have fun.
Yeah.
Is this going to become a trope? Just we're exploring various topics, and then it's back to, all right, time to mistreat some wildlife. Let's go.
Maybe that, but also the me promising you guys will have fun. And just remember, anytime I say the word fun, it's capitalized and there's a registered trademark at the end. Yeah, so with all that in mind, do you guys like cats?
Like is an understatement.
I enjoy cats.
Yeah. And yes, I know we all have cats. It was just a segue I wrote into the script. Get off my back. I have a cat as well. She's somewhere. She will probably make a visit. So we all like cats. How about French cyborg space cats? Does that sound like something that interests you?
Yeah, it does.
We're diving.
So yeah, we're not talking about the Soviets. We're going to talk about the early French space program, and we're going to get back to poor innocent test animals. But like really anything we do in these series, the first thing we're going to do is have to cover the historical context and explain why these space cats are made into cyborgs.
Origins of the French space program.
Okay, so the Soviet Union and the United States, they're pretty well known as the two main competitors in the space race, right? Like, you've got racing to launch satellites, racing to launch humans, racing to the moon, all that. It's always been the Soviets and the Americans. It is less well known that a lot of other countries actually set up their own space programs to try and get in on that gold rush. But without the power, the resources, the funding, and let's face it, the ex-Nazi scientists that the big superpowers had, most of those programs were actually pretty modest. For example, in 1962, both Canada and the UK launched their own satellites on American rockets, named Alouette 1 and Ariel 1, respectively.
Okay.
The Soviets, meanwhile, started the Intercosmos program, which would launch satellites and cosmonauts from allied nations. Through Intercosmos, Czechoslovakian cosmonaut Vladimir Remek became the first person in orbit not from the US or USSR, and Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez from Cuba reached orbit more than 4 years before Canadian astronaut Marc Garneau. The point of all this is to explain that lots of countries got in on the space race, but most of them did this by either siding with the US or the USSR and then leveraging those rockets. France did not do this.
France is a proud nation.
Yes, as we're going to get to, because this is France after World War II. And its leader, Charles de Gaulle, being Charles de Gaulle, was fanatically against France being reliant on another country for anything. This started off with defense, with France becoming the fifth country to build nuclear weapons, but quickly extended to the new space race too. If France was going to do space research, they wouldn't be ride-sharing with anyone. They'd be entering the space race as a full-fledged competitor.
You know what? Honestly, kudos to them.
Yeah.
Not taking the easy way out.
They aimed high. And I mean, I'm sure people can figure out just from the present that they didn't really achieve that. But hey, at least it's better than, the UK or Canada just being content with, building a satellite or two.
Immediately sliding into the paperclip territory just a little bit. No, seriously, kudos to them. It might not have been economically efficient, but as a point of national pride, I would take that.
Starting in 1949, France began designing a series of sounding rockets to launch payloads into space on suborbital trajectories and building a launch site to, launch them from. But because rockets are dangerous and falling parts could be a risk to people nearby, they decided to put it far away from anyone they considered important. Do you want to guess who they didn't consider important?
Algerians.
The English.
Am I correct?
Okay, actually, Chris gets it right. So they picked the town of Hammaguir, I'm sorry if I got that name wrong, in the then colony of Algeria.
100%, because why would the French actually care about anyone?
Yeah, that's true. I probably should have thought of that one.
It's not a hard guess when the answer is racism every time.
Gee, I wonder who the French could fuck over next.
Backup site, Vietnam.
We're not America. Hold up.
No,
they lost that privilege.
Yeah. They got rockets shot at them.
Oh.
Yeah. Bien bien foo, never forget.
It doesn't make it any better.
Over a 9-year development period, the rockets, which were officially called Project 4213, but scientists called, so I'm going to call these things Véronique, just for the sake of, keeping this going. In French, it'd be, Véronique. Anyway, these rockets proved themselves to be effective, but also dangerously prone to guidance failures and explosions. Keep that in mind. It will be important later.
I don't like the dark undertone that you just said.
Everything I say has a dark undertone. What are you talking about?
This is in bold.
Okay, no, in my script, it's in italics. Thank you.
And
I'm not kidding.
What's wrong with, what do the Italians do?
No, we talked about Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti last time. We are not bringing Italy into this again.
All right.
Let's trigger Chris and talk about cuisine.
I won't forget this.
The country with the fewest space failures because they just never bothered to try.
Ooh.
Anyway, around the time that the Véronique rockets were starting to launch, France also set up an agency to study the effects of space on living animals. So it's important to note that for most of this time, France didn't actually have a central space agency to coordinate everyone. Instead, they had a ton of small, specialized agencies that all handled different subjects. And because of funding changes and, general government turnover, these agents were always fighting for power, eating each other, or constantly getting rolled into new hybrid organizations. CERMA, or CERMA, whose acronym translates in English to the Center for Teaching and Research of Aerospace Medicine, actually started as a merger of the CEBA, a civilian agency dedicated to studying hypoxia, and the SMPAA, a French Air Force detachment for studying physiology. Somehow, when these two got mixed together, you got an agency that would be put in charge of France's animal space flights on the other side. Yeah, so just like a weird culture of like, have you guys ever played that like agar.io game?
Yeah.
It's like that. All of these little organizations like slowly
The blobs.
hunting around, yeah, and then they eat each other and they get bigger, and eventually they just form into like a couple of big organizations.
I was stuck doing the arithmetic of how hypoxia research and like what was it? I'm sorry, it was like a military.
It was a French Air Force studying physiology during flight. Yeah, and somehow when you cram these together, you got
animals,
orbital animals. Yeah, like what kind of alchemy did some bureaucrat in France do?
They created something awful.
They created something wonderful. And they would get their chance to study in 1957 when the French government earmarked 15 new Varonic rockets to CERMA for biological studies. And these were actually considered a big priority at the time. Remember, like France was planning on following the Soviets and Americans with this and eventually wanted to launch humans. Both other countries had already launched animals and all that data was available, but France wanted to be self-sustaining and not rely on that data. They also considered the American and Soviet tests to be ridiculously simplistic and to have not produced any real research. To be honest, they might have had a bit of a case here because whenever you get down to it, American monkeys flew into space comatose, and the most data they could produce was just like their heart rate and their breathing. The Soviets were only a little bit better. Their dogs were awake, and some capsules had, small cameras for watching them, but that was about it.
And then they died.
Yeah. If CERMA was going to launch animals into space, they'd do it properly and make sure to squeeze and wring as much science out of their animals as possible. And with 15 rockets and good funding, they finally had their chance. All that remained was to pick what type of animal to launch.
Section 1. Rats and frogs.
And you will never guess what animal they picked first. You want to try?
Well, we're talking about one animal, so I'm going to have to guess.
The French. What
Okay.
other French animal?
Come on.
In modern media,
You're so close.
they sent the rat.
Frogs. They picked frogs.
I was gonna hinge this into Ratatouille.
And then they immediately switched to rats after it turned out that sticking an electrode to a frog's skin is really difficult. So, like, half points there.
Slight aside, per Ratatouille, the rat was controlling a human in that movie. So,
Yeah,
Okay, stop predicting stuff. Give me a second.
is this how French astronauts do EVA? I
Every
shall
French-
be better
yeah.
than the sum of my parts.
So they also made some changes too. Instead of sticking electrodes to the rat's skin, the scientists at CERMA decided to get a little invasive. From Animals in Space, quote, "In November 1959, after several lengthy but unsuccessful attempts, Dr. Chatelier was able to surgically affix electrodes to the skull of a rat, enabling the activity of the brain cortex and reticular formation to be recorded. At the same time, other surgical probes monitored the activity of the diaphragm muscle and recorded the electromyographic activity of the muscles at the nape of the neck, as well as the animal's heart rate, respiratory frequency, and body temperature." So they just Borged a bunch of rats.
Oh, God.
How did
How did that get into their heads? Like who had the idea?
What
Yes.
is this, time to assume direct control about French?
how does that work? How do you implant an electrode into the brain without fucking up the brain?
So you actually can do that, and there are human examples of that. It's actually been used for a few years now in some extreme cases for like the treatment of certain mental illnesses. In most cases, though,
Also
it
physical, too,
sends
in some-
out. Yeah, they send out little timed pulses to kind of either stimulate or prevent overactivity in certain parts of the brain. And it's basically just, it doesn't need to be a huge invasive thing. Like it can just be a couple of small spikes going in at the right spots so they don't actually mess with the brain.
They're not just jackhammering wires into a skull. They are
Yes.
mapping out certain centers of the brain that perform certain functions.
That's modern neurosurgery on humans. We're talking about French neurosurgery in the 50s on rats. So it was a lot more of the hammering stuff into their skulls.
Gently, because they still need the rats to live for a while.
After their surgeries, each rat was put through a training routine, mostly to get them accustomed to doing normal rat things with electrodes implanted into their skulls. Like, I want to make that clear. For these flights, the rats were not expected to do anything. They didn't have any kind of tests to run or like mazes to go through.
Just exist.
But the scientists wanted to do training because they were worried that a load of brain surgery might influence a rat's behavior a little bit.
Oh, so they wanted to get something akin to a baseline for the rats.
They wanted to get the rats to forget that they had huge electrodes coming out of their skulls and just act normally.
The rats on their mission, current objective, survive.
Yes. This training included, quote, painlessly hanging each rat by its tail inside immobilization chambers for incrementally lengthy periods, as well as being whirled around in a centrifuge device exposing them to different accelerations and vibrations. This might sound like a lot of training on paper, but the ratstronauts actually, most of them got a very rushed training schedule. This is because after implantation, each rat had a useful lifespan of just 3 to 6 months. This is partially due to polarization of the electrodes and the aging of the rats, but mostly because the electrical connectors were fixed on with model glue that slowly dissolved the rats' skulls.
It's awful.
They couldn't even cut.
Yes.
Oh, I see. It doesn't
like,
make
have
it
you ever
better.
made a model plane or a model tank as a kid and you use that model glue where if you get it on your finger, it hurts? They just smeared that directly onto the rats' brains.
God, Ratatouille had a tough time after that.
This is not
movie.
Ratatouille. This is Secrets of Nim.
See,
The other movie that traumatized me as a
okay.
child. Now, by early 1960, CERMA was getting ready for their first rat launch, which was scheduled for the 20th of February. There was actually a lot of nervousness 2 days before a different Veronica rocket had exploded on the launch pad. Then, on the day of the launch, the scientists discovered that their ratstronaut had managed to gnaw through the electrical cables in his container, making it useless.
my man,
Yes,
fight the
you have to
power.
wonder if he knew. He knew.
He knew.
He had to have known.
He knew.
They pushed the launch back 2 days so they could make repairs and selected a new, dumber rat to fly, who would get the name Hector. He even got his own little spacesuit. So if you look in the pictures, he's the rat wearing the spacesuit.
Oh my God, he's a baby.
And he didn't get the huge skull implants, although he did get a lot of implants.
Got a skull jack with a small.
So whenever they put him in the pod, it's actually interesting. Like his vest had a couple of hooks on it, and they would hook springs to each of those points on his suit. So he's like basically held in the air in like a Superman pose while he's flying.
Super rat.
And this is also to give some like shock absorption because it'll help like dampen the vibrations.
Oh yes, because after all, he is in a fucking rocket. Oh baby, no.
I love his spacesuit.
So Hector lifted off on February 22nd, 1960. The rocket's engines had problems, though, burning for only 25 seconds and producing much less force than expected. They also had guidance problems that led to the rocket spinning wildly out of control.
No.
Because of this, Hector only reached an altitude of 69 miles, less than half the planned height. But because the Kármán line, the altitude where space legally begins, is at 60 miles or 100 kilometers, this was still enough to make Hector the first animal launched into space by France. He was recovered safe and healthy after an 8-minute flight and flown to Paris, where he was kept under observation for the next few months.
Thank God.
Hector's flight obviously wasn't as big news on the world stage because like the Soviets and Americans had completed similar tests more than 10 years earlier.
Who gives a fuck? He's alive.
But it was big in France and taken as proof that they'd have a role to play in the future of space exploration. Hector even got a children's cartoon series made after him named Hector the Space Rat.
Wait, what?
Yeah. 6 months after his flight, Hector was euthanized so they could see how zero-G had affected his implants.
The French fucking strike.
Oh, this was an emotional roller coaster.
Yes.
You bring my boy into the picture and then you kill him.
Yeah. So the follow-up flights would eventually happen more than 20 months later in October 1962. A rat named Castor flew first and experienced around 6 minutes of weightlessness. He landed safely, but unfortunately his capsule sat in the desert sun for over an hour before rescue crews found him, and he died from heat frustration. As bad as that is, Castor was actually lucky. His backup Pollux flew 3 days later. His rocket flew off course immediately and landed more than 88 miles from the launch pad. They sent out helicopters to search but never found his capsule. He's probably still out there somewhere.
Cool, he probably died when it jackhammered into the earth.
No,
Yeah.
He escaped. And lived a
We have
happy
to
life.
believe.
Wait, is there a mythical...
He's on a farm. He's on a farm with Laika and every other space dog and monkey. The Alberts are there.
There's a mythical rat colony we don't know about.
This is how you would get Skaven, though, in real life.
The French rat colony is alive!
Like, cyborg radioactive space rats is how you get real-life Skaven.
God, can you just imagine...
Especially if you teach them to hate and, like, abandon them in the desert.
Can you just imagine a rat that huge just rolling up to you, yelling at you in French, and then just slicing your shit in half? That is what they are responsible for.
Section 2. Cyborg Space Cats.
Yeah, so a year after Hector's flight, President Charles de Gaulle decided to streamline all of France's various competing space agencies and military units, creating the Centre National d'Études Spatiales, or the National Center for Space Studies, or CNES, which still exists today as part of the ESA. Their first task was to continue the animal flights. Now, after losing 2 out of 3 rats in rocket failures, the engineers at CNES decided they needed a new rocket and started working on an improved Veronic design they called Vesta. So Vesta was designed to fly further, carry bigger payloads, and more importantly, be safer for the occupant. But this is still a show about space failures, so if I'm talking about it, probably know it didn't work.
Cool, the atmosphere is now, a billionth of a % rat because of this.
Not rats.
Oh, yeah.
Like with Sputnik 1, there was a lot of political pressure to get results quickly and not wait for the better design. They also couldn't just launch another rat. They needed something more impressive. Which is how, 4 pages into the script, we get to Space Cats. A group of 14 recruits were picked off the streets of Paris and put through similar training as the American space chimps and Soviet space dogs. They picked female stray cats off the streets of Paris. Females because they tended to be calmer than males, and strays because, like with the space dogs, the scientists reasoned that stray cats would be more used to stress and surviving. Candidates were then subjected to all kinds of brutal training. They got spun up in centrifuges, sat in pressure chambers, and did all their training while loud, scary rocket noises were played nearby. This had 2 purposes. First, to prepare the cats for their flights, but also to use them as dummies for future human testing. And that's where comparisons to the Soviet and American animal programs end completely. See, the Soviets and Americans kept careful track of their recruits and had full-on psychological profiles. On top of that, for the most part, they seem to have actually cared for their recruits. American space chimps and monkeys got dedicated handlers to look after them, while Soviet space dogs were often adopted by scientists after they retired from the program. And that was not the case in France. French space cats were not even given names until just before launch. This is because the people in charge of the program were worried that French scientists might get attached to the cats or feel bad for them.
Yeah, I could never be a French scientist.
Yeah. Why would they need to feel bad for the cats, you may be asking? Because each of the 14 cats got the trademark French treatment for space animals, going through a 10-hour operation to have electrodes implanted into their brains.
Oh, and some of that good old skull-eating Modic glue.
Yeah, and this wasn't the simple wire or two that the rats got from animals in space. Quote, the electrophysiological recordings would be far more comprehensive than those achievable with the smaller rats, taking in data on the left associative cortex, the right hippocampus, and the mesencephalic tissue. I'm probably butchering some of those, but suffice to say, these cats got a lot more surgery than the rats. Like I said, it took 10 hours for each cat to go through an operation.
And then to have the surgeons basically fuck up all their efforts with, yes, we have finished this marvel of neural surgery. Model glue time.
And if you're wondering what the implants looked like, these things were not subtle. So you can see a picture here. If you're on YouTube, you'll see it now. For the listeners, why don't you guys describe what this looks like?
Sadness. Look at how they massacred my baby.
Wake the fuck up, Gata. We have space to explore.
It is pretty cyberpunk. If you've ever worked on or built a home PC, chances are you've used parts like this. Each cat had a bit of their skull, a bit of their heads shaved, and an electrical pin connector mounted directly to their skulls. These implants were also very fragile. The connectors had exposed pins that could get damaged while the cat was doing, cat things. So they even had to put special-made caps on them to just protect the implants from the cats.
What if it rubs up against something and static shocks itself? I don't like tuna anymore.
Oh, and it's it's like a motherboard. If you bend a single pin, it's just you gotta just throw it out. It's no good anymore. You don't get a warranty on those.
I will adopt the cat. They deserve to go home.
So these surgeries were normally done about 2 months before launch. If they did them earlier, they'd run into the same problem they did with the rats, that the implants would break down or dissolve the cat's brain, which meant that each cat effectively had an expiration date. It was very possible that launch or program delays could kill these cats. Now, also like the rats, a lot of the training after this operation involved just getting the cats used to having massive cyberpunk skull jacks implanted into their heads. They went through all the same centrifuges, pressure chambers, and rocket noises as before, except now they had a giant set of cables coming out of their heads.
Oh no.
Hey, my cat's here. So, on October 18th, 1963, a Voronic rocket carried the first cat into space. She'd performed the best of any of the other candidates and was picked for how remarkably calm she was in training and after her surgery. Now, because of the French rules, she only got a name just before launch. They named her C341. And yes, the C stands for cat.
They gave it a name. And thus they are doomed to become attached to it.
They gave it like an alphanumerical. They just like cat 341. That's it.
You're on a mission for our people. That's what's on.
Her flight went well, and C-341 experienced a few minutes of weightlessness before parachuting back to Earth. Recovery teams found her just 13 minutes after launch in her usual calm, doped-up mood. And you can imagine the French wanted to show off their new achievement. Thinking that maybe C-341 wasn't an appropriate name for a space hero, French newspapers started calling her Felix the Cat, named after the famous cartoon character. CNES took the name Felix and turned it into Felicette, which stuck.
Oh, my girl.
Yeah.
The baby. Now they are doomed. Now she has a real name.
Now they can actually hurt us. Which I'm assuming they fucking did.
Felicette became an overnight star in France. Even though she only flew on a suborbital trajectory 2 years after humans had already flown into orbit, her flight put France into the space race. To drum up public support, they even made these little postcards that were signed, quote-unquote, by Felicette. Like, they just put some ink on her paw and stamp it on the card. And actually, after doing this for long enough, even like the famously calm Felicette got bored of this, and they just had to start using other cats to start stamping the signatures. Yeah, and fun story, the Americans would actually like wind up doing the exact same thing with Ham, the space chimp. They start like his autographs, eventually they just started using whatever chimp they had handy.
Then what, put the chimp in the hand slap machine?
But this is where we actually get into a problem. Everything they made to advertise their big success had a big picture of cyberpunk-looking Felicette's face on the front. From Animals in Space, quote, "In days when most spaceflight milestones made for good headlines, the British press quickly dubbed the flight an outstanding achievement. However, the accompanying photographs of Felicette with electrodes surgically fitted to her head like a bellboy's skull cap were far from appealing to many readers, especially those involved in the burgeoning animal rights movement." So, like, as soon as they advertise their big space achievement, like, the public's immediate reaction is not, "Oh, that's wonderful." It's, what did you do to that cat? Like, what did you do to her?
Yeah, that was my reaction.
It wasn't my girl. No.
Oh, don't worry, we got some good science. Is she okay? What did you do?
Did she live, meanwhile, back to France?
They're just like sending individual walk commands through the implants.
Why have you done this? You've hurt me so.
This is pain.
As someone who likes cats.
Yeah. So Felicette's reception was sort of spotty, and unfortunately she did not have long to enjoy her modest fame. Like Hector, Felicette was euthanized 2 months after her launch so scientists could see how her implants functioned. Spoiler alert, they functioned fine.
Awesome.
Yeah. Totally worth it.
As if they couldn't, look at her implants and realize, wait, there's no deviation from baseline.
Also,
now.
they could have taken them out safely. That was something they had the power to do.
And even better yet, if you're simply talking about the function of the implants, they had to have had so much just recorded data of, this is baseline Felicette. We are not doing anything to the cat. The cat is simply vibing. Here she is. Meanwhile, no, we must kill cat.
Even in the years after her death, Felicette's legacy has been questionable, both for the implants the scientists used, as well as their decision to kill what was supposed to be a national hero. Like, with all the advertising, they sort of had to, they tried to have their cake and eat it. With, look at this incredible achievement, also we put her down. In America, Ham the Space Chimp was buried in state at the International Space Hall of Fame. In the Soviet Union, you can find statues of Laika all over, from her home city of Moscow to her launch site in Baikonur. Felicette never got any of that. The most she got was actually a set of stamps that misspelled her name.
Disrespect!
Yeah. It wasn't until 2017 that a Kickstarter campaign set up by a private citizen raised enough money to build a statue that currently sits in the International Space University in Strasbourg, France. So she does at least have a statue, and I'll have a picture here. It is a very good statue. It's like she's sitting on top of a globe looking upwards at the stars. It's really nice. Still a shame it had to happen through a Kickstarter 5 years ago.
Better now than never.
So, Felicette was the only cat to ever successfully fly into space, but this is not for lack of trying on France's part. 6 days after Felicette's flight, they actually launched another cat. The rocket reached an altitude of 55 miles or 88 kilometers before exploding.
No!
Killing the unfortunate and unnamed astrocat. This one did not even get a name.
Chris, it could be worse.
It is worse. Of the other 12 cats that were trained and implanted for the program, none were ever launched. However, 11 were euthanized when the program was shut down. One was actually lucky. Her electrodes had started to degrade right after her operation, so scientists removed them safely and adopted the cat as a team mascot, naming her Scooby-Doo. So they could safely and easily remove the implants without harming the cat.
And they proved that they could!
Yes. and Scooby-Doo got her implants out before Felicette launched. Like, this is immediately after she gets implanted. They realize they messed something up.
Thanks, I hate it.
Yeah. So 1 out of 14 survived. 1 out of 14 actually made it to space.
You just spat in my fucking drink. You have ruined my night. I could have saved her.
And that is where our story of cyborg space cats ends. But only because the France found a new type of animal to lobotomize.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh, no.
What, human beings?
Close.
Primates. Wonderful.
Section 3. Cyborg Space Monkeys.
Remember how we talked about that new Vesta rocket the French were developing? Well, after proving his method with space cats, Dr. Grandpierre, the scientist in charge of the animal testing program, was finally given 2 of the more powerful rockets. So with the larger rockets and the heavier payload they could lift, the French scientists decided to do one better than cats and graduate to primates, since remember, their goal was still to simulate and eventually launch humans. They eventually picked the pig-tailed macaque because of their compact size and because they are considered a lot calmer than other macaques like the rhesus monkeys the Americans used. The monkeys were also noted for their social behavior and for forming strong emotional bonds with their handlers, making them easier to train. The pig-tailed macaque is also very endangered, and will only get more endangered during our story.
Oh.
No, I have to mention something. You're talking about...
Why is it always... But it gets worse.
Yeah, like they have a program whose whole job... Like, remember how with the cats, the French did not want their scientists making connections. And then they picked a monkey
known for making
forming
connections.
Very strong social connections, and they picked an endangered species.
Are they playing shithead bingo for animal choices?
Gentlemen, we've found our next candidate. It's the black-footed ferret. There's 12 of them. That means we can launch 12.
That just leaves such a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah.
Holy hell.
Drink more beer. Like the cats, the monkeys went through training to get them used to enclosed spaces, vibrations, and loud, scary rocket noises. Unlike with the cats, these monkeys would actually have tasks that they would be expected to perform during their flights. French scientists built little spacesuits for the monkeys that could hold them in place in their capsules, but leave them free to move their arms. In front of each monkey was a panel with a food dispenser and a set of levers. It took 10 months, but eventually they were able to train the monkeys to pull the levers in sequence to get food pellets.
Oh, like, if it just had a random assortment of levers, they would train them to go, okay, cool, top left lever, center lever, top left lever, bottom right.
Like, it wasn't just left to right, like, they trained them a sequence of, like, they actually trained them several sequences that would get more complicated, so the monkey would have to do, like, left lever, left, right, right, stuff like that, to get more food.
Oh. Well, still,
so, like,
fuck
pretty
them, but
cool.
Still, that is...
Yeah.
Good exercise and training.
And if you thought I was going to leave it out, they also implanted electrodes into the brains of every monkey. Here's a picture of one.
And because why would they stop at this point?
You can see, like, this one is even more cyberpunk.
That is the definition of wake the fuck up, samurai. We have space to explore.
It's literally 2 connectors. Like, the cat's only got 1 connector. That monkey has 2 connectors back to back in a mohawk over its head.
You know, one of them is a kill switch in case the Americans find the landed satellite.
We are eventually okay. No, I'm. It's Soviet. Am I allowed to say a Soviet thing?
No, you must resist. It's a slippery slope.
It's Soviet September. I can't do it.
You've questioned it. You cannot continue. Don't worry, we can have 2 back-to-back episodes on the start of
You guys are keeping
month.
me honest, as are the listeners. After training, they narrowed it down to 2 candidates, Martine and Pierrette, which means pebble. And on March 7th, 1967, Martine was successfully launched from Algeria and reached an altitude of 142 miles, or 230 kilometers.
Oh.
Yeah, she spent a few minutes in zero-G and performed her tests well. Just 15 minutes after launch, she was recovered safely in the desert and was flown back to France for her recuperation and observation.
You say they kill her.
6 days later, Pebble flew to an altitude of 145 miles and was also recovered safely. Like with the cat flights, despite having a load of trained monkeys all with implanted electrodes, they never launched more than just the first 2 Vesta rockets they were given. Martine and Pierrette were the last animals France would ever actually launch into space. And I wish I could give you a happy ending. But the French had a method that I'm sure you've pretty well seen by now.
Kill the animals.
After a few months of observation by CNES, both were euthanized for further dissection and study. From the limited info we have, I do not know what happened to the other trained monkeys, but considering they all got the implants, I do not like their odds. And remember, these monkeys are very endangered.
Why would that stop them?
Oh man, this sucks.
Oh, don't worry, they're just animals. They're nothing we can get emotionally attached to. Oh, wait.
That's why you only give them number names.
Oh, God.
C341 is how you should have kept it.
No. She deserves to be remembered.
Yeah, Martine and Pebble, rip.
I love Pebble.
Although they're probably most famous for putting implants into the heads of every animal they could get their hands on, the French scientists did actually get a lot of valuable data that neither the Soviets nor the Americans had. For the first time, it was actually possible to see what effects zero-G could have on an animal's brain. So, we haven't talked about it much in a while, but I want to go back to those early episodes where we kept saying, they did not know what would happen. No one had any experience with extended zero-G exposure or what cosmic rays could do. They did not know. Back then, they were worried that blood wouldn't flow properly through the brain, or that maybe gravity had some effect on neurons that we didn't understand. By implanting electrodes into their test animals, the French scientists at CNES gave the world the best possible data at that time. Now, I am not personally coming down on the side of those scientists, especially with how defective these electrodes proved to be and their decision to kill almost every test animal after their program closed.
Euthanization does very much seem secondary to the data collection facet of it. And if they very much collected good data and the animals landed, then we know that it was a success, because any kind of disruption of blood to the brain, even for a short period of time, usually creates long-lasting disruptions to the animal or person.
Hence why every animal that flew had several months of observation after, because on top of the electrodes, they wanted to see what, if any, health concerns might come up with the animal, if there were any long-term effects of zero-G exposure. But at the same time, like we talked about, they had a way of removing these implants safely. They did it to one of their cats and made that cat a mascot. Not to mention, as we just talked about, their decision to use an endangered species as a test animal.
Did they know it was... I don't want to, advocate for the French, but did they know that it was endangered at the time? I was to ask.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Double bastard.
After all of that, in the interest of fairness, no other space program was able to get information that detailed from their test animals. I do, my personal disagreements with the matter aside, I do feel like that needs to be mentioned. They did get results, regardless of how you feel about it.
That's why I mentioned the disconnect between they collected good data and then they killed it.
And then it's like mission accomplished, ethics failed.
Yes. When it comes out to the end of the day, it is not a human life. And that's not the best take in all circumstances. It's still a better take than sending up someone and not knowing how it could potentially turn out. Even if it's not the same. It's still...
It's better than sending up convicted French prisoners with electrodes stuck in their head and euthanizing them when they get back.
They still have rights.
Now, in the grand scheme, though, all that didn't really matter. From Animals in Space, quote, following the Vesta flights, Robert Grandpierre left CERMA and took another position in Bordeaux. On July 1st, 1967, the Hammaguir launch site would be abandoned and turned over to independent Algeria under an agreement ratified in 1962. A newer, far larger launch facility would then be established amid the tropical forests at Kourou in French Guiana, South America. Although further biological flights had been discussed by Grandpierre's colleagues and successors, these plans never came to fruition. The French program of biological rocket flights was subsequently abandoned, apart from those later carried out in cooperation with the Russians and Americans under the auspices of CNES. And that is the story of the cyborg test animals of the French space program and where we are going to leave off this episode. How do we all feel?
Miserable.
Hell yeah.
Pain, but I understand the purpose of it. I may not want to, but I can understand the purpose.
My personal take is I understand putting the electrodes in.
It's the needless.
Yeah, because if you want to do that level of research, they did get results. They got neurological results, which is something that no other program had.
They let them live for multiple months afterwards with observation.
Yes.
The part that gets me is that they did all of this after both the Americans and the Soviets had sent a man into space.
Yuri Gagarin flew years earlier.
But he did not have things in his skull. Also, Yuri Gagarin is not necessarily the most normal of men to start with.
Yeah, we don't know. Maybe his brain got fried up there. That would certainly explain how he acted.
But the problem is that any credible scientist is going to take substantial before and after notes because you need to know the effect of the actions you have performed. We have that.
He went into space and came back with a newfound love for European sports cars.
He also walked funny and had a rat on his shoulder at all times.
He wore a suspiciously tall chef hat.
But yeah, that is the history of the cyborg French space cats. Thank you for listening.
The big disconnect is I'm okay, or more okay with people fucking up in space. Because the difference is that animals have not created the fuck up. They are subjected to it.
Yeah, an animal by definition is the victim of a space failure.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.